Cutdown day has officially come and gone. Who has made the Seahawks 53-man roster heading into the 2024 season? And what are some of the biggest surprises? We're going to be breaking it all down here on a loaded Tuesday episode of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to each and every one of the 12s listening in. Whether you're tuning in from Spokane, Washington, or over in Duluth, Minnesota, we appreciate each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. One of the craziest days, and unfortunately one of the most disappointing days on the calendar for the NFL has come and gone. The 53-man roster cut down the Seahawks today, releasing a bunch of players, putting players on the reserve PUP list, a number of moves being made to get down to that 53-man limit. And Rob, as we always say when we look at these depth charts and when the 53-man roster comes out, the big key here is to understand that these are initial roster cuts. This is not the roster the Seahawks are going to be throwing out there in week one. I can guarantee you there's at least 5 or 6 guys that made this initial team that will not be on the roster when the Seahawks play the Broncos in week one. So this is really just a stepping stone to what I believe will be the official 53-man roster that we'll see probably a week from now.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, Corbin, and a great way to kind of start it off. It's kind of like when you run off to the grocery store and you forget the list at home. You're going off of memory. You're trying to get everything that you wanted, and then you get home and you realize I got a couple of other things that I needed to get done. So with that opener against the Denver Broncos a couple of weeks away, or a week and a half away, I guess I should say, then as you just said, I think that you can expect there to be some future moves that the Seahawks are going to make. I think that when you're looking at the big picture of this initial 53-man roster, to me, the single biggest storyline here is the fact that Uchenna Nwosu is on the initial 53. He is not part of that initial IR setting that we kind of talked about before. There's going to be some hand-wringing about some of the names that we're going to be talking a little bit later that are not on Seattle's initial 53-man roster. But Corbin, I think that Seahawks fans have got to be ecstatic right now, because what that suggests is that the Seahawks believe that number 10 is going to be on the field faster than the 4-game schedule, or the 4-game inability to be there for the first 4 games that we had talked about previously. So it's almost like they're getting a very good player back on a day where it's mostly going to be talking about players that have been released.
Yeah, that's the unfortunate reality. And this is probably the toughest day for coaches and players and front office members, everybody that's involved with NFL teams, because you spend all these months building relationships and building chemistry and developing players. And at the end of the day, you can't keep everybody. And almost half your roster that you've been working with throughout OTAs, mini camps, training camp, preseason, almost half those players are now gone. They're either going to be coming back in the practice squad. Some of these guys, their NFL dreams are being dashed, or maybe they end up playing elsewhere. But this is always a difficult day. And when you look at the cuts that were made by the Seahawks today, there's a lot of them that are not surprising at all. And as you said, we're going to have more time as this show unfolds to really dive into the ones that are surprising. But there's a few moves in particular that I think we need to look at closely, because some fans may not understand why certain players were released. And I think the name that jumps out first to me here is John Radigan, the veteran linebacker who you and I both had making this roster. And I thought, since the Seahawks had over $11 million in cap space, I didn't think that a almost $3 million salary for John Radigan, I didn't necessarily think that was going to be something that was going to be a precursor for him getting cut. But ultimately, if you're going to be a backup and a special teams player, that is still a pretty hefty price tag for a guy that you're hoping isn't going to play very many snaps on defense. You hope that Tyrell Dodson and Jerome Baker and Tyrese Knight is ahead of Radigan at this point. He has leapfrogged over him, as the Seahawks thought he was going to. So a 4th-string linebacker, $3 million, it doesn't add up. The Seahawks want to make a move at the trade deadline. Now they're going to have more flexibility. And this doesn't mean that John Radigan isn't going to come back either. We have seen plenty of times in the past under John Schneider that the Seahawks have cut players like John Radigan who were on these restricted free agent tenders, and they were able to bring him back at a much cheaper cost. He does offer value on special teams. So that would just be one player that jumps out on the list that many may not have expected to get cut. But the more that you think about it, it makes a lot of sense why the Seahawks would do this, what could ultimately just be a maneuver to get him back at a cheaper price.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I think that it is. Again, you mentioned numbers. I mean, almost $3 million in terms of that contract. And given the fact that he is at best operating at second on the depth chart and perhaps as much as third on the depth chart. So to me, John Radigan was a surprise initially until I heard about his salary. Then I wasn't quite as surprised by that. However, for those of you watching on YouTube, you might see a name that is highlighted there. And thank you, whether you're watching or whether you're listening. But the tackle guard, McClendon Curtis. Corbin, I've been gushing about this young man now for weeks on end, and I was really impressed with what I saw from him in the last preseason game where the Seahawks asked him to play at the left tackle position after previously, of course, playing right guard and right tackle. To me, it just demonstrated his versatility. And so while I did think that the offensive line was going to have more players than some others were anticipating, I certainly expected McClendon Curtis to be a part of that. So to me, that was one of the big surprises. And he doesn't have the big price tag that John Radigan had. So that was, to me, the biggest surprise of the initial cuts.
Yeah, I think when you look at a roster construction standpoint here, the Seahawks kept 11 offensive linemen, and Curtis was not one of them. If you would have told me that yesterday, I would have said, there's no way. You're lying. There's no way that that's going to be the way this plays out. But ultimately, the Seahawks wanted to keep their draft picks, Satawa Lamea and Mike Jarrell, both making this initial roster. Stone Forsythe, because he has played a lot of football. He has started a lot of games, with Abraham Lucas being on the reserve pup list, as I'll get to here in a second. You got to have that experience component as well. So it seems like this initial roster was about keeping as many of these offensive linemen as they could, and the ones that they thought they could sneak to the practice squad. McClendon Curtis is a former undrafted player. They may have viewed him as an easier player to sneak to the practice squad than Mike Jarrell, who's a 95 percentile athlete at the tackle position. That would have been a much trickier player to try to move to your practice squad. So there are all these little mechanisms that are part of this, and there's certain positions that have different values. I mean, the Seahawks only keeping 5 corners, for example. It's because there's a lot of corners in the NFL. There's a lot of teams that have a lot of good corners. Those guys are easier to slip through. Receiver is an easier position to slip through, and maybe even running back, an easier position to slip guys through. So that went into a lot of these decisions. But as far as the other moves that were made by the Seahawks in these roster cuts, terminated veterans, these are the guys that don't go to the waiver wire with more than 4 years of accrued experience. They instantly become free agents. Marquise Blair, Artie Burns. I thought Artie Burns was going to be on an injured list of some sort, but they just terminated his contract. Quarterback P.J. Walker, and then linebacker Blake Lynch. Jack Westover, the pride of Mount Si. He's got a hamstring injury, so he was waived, injured. And probably the biggest news here, Rob, Abraham Lucas, along with Cameron Young and Jarek Reed II. None of those players activated to the roster. They are on the reserve pup list now going into the season. All 3 of these players have to miss at least 4 games. And obviously, one of those names is a lot bigger and a lot more important than the other 2 for the Seahawks going into the season.
Yeah, similar to what we talked about before with Uchenna Nwosu, we all know the impact that a healthy Abe Lucas at right tackle has from the Seahawks. Again, one of the reasons why I was surprised that McClendon Curtis was not on that initial 53 list. But as we talked about, the Abe Lucas, Jarek Reed, and then Cameron Young, all 3 of them coming off of the surgeries. We knew that this was going to be a possibility, but it is concerning that now you know for sure that the earliest that these players can come back in would be into the 5th game of the season. And so that is again, a bit of a concern. And you mentioned the cornerback Artie Burns and the fact that, as a vested veteran, then he doesn't have to go through the same kind of waiver process. I wonder if this is another cost-saving move by the Seahawks. It's one that, Artie Burns had played very well, but kind of like we talked about before with John Radigan, and the fact that, you're essentially going to be playing as the number 3 linebacker, or at best number 2. And while a quality special teamer, you can also see the athletic limitations. You can see some limitations in coverage. With Artie Burns, he'd been playing very, very well in coverage as well as in run defense. This one surprised me, but we talked about it in yesterday's show. While many were focusing in on the injury to Chen Nwosu, the more concerning one was the way that Artie Burns kind of stepped up and or basically fell down and had to get carted off. And so this to me is completely a medical situation. The Seahawks are going to have to kind of evaluate this process and see if they can get Artie Burns back onto the field for them. If he clears waivers, then the Seahawks have the right to bring him back.
Well, again, he's a vested veteran, so he doesn't have waivers that he has to worry about. He is just instantly a free agent. But this could be kind of that unofficial move to wait till after next weekend's deadline where you don't have guaranteed salaries anymore. You can bring back Artie Burns if he's healthy enough to play. So there's a lot of different mechanisms at play here. And that's why we have an entire episode dedicated to breaking down this initial 53-man roster. When we come back, we're going to dive deeper into the surprises, the players that made the team that we didn't expect were going to be on the roster, the players who got cut that we did think were going to make this football team, and of course, what the biggest moves were coming out of cutdown day. We'll get to all that coming up next here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. You've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Well, we have something a little different for you. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. With a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. You can bet on everything from DK Metcalf making the all-pro football team to Byron Murphy II being Rookie of the Year, or even Mike McDonald as a first-time head coach getting Coach of the Year leading the Seahawks. Just throw in a $5 bet, and you'll get a 3-week free trial to NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Just visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to download America's #1 sportsbook. Welcome back to the Locked On Seahawks podcast, Tuesday edition. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to each and every one of the 12s listening in to this live episode. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you. For your second listen, make sure to check out the Locked On Fantasy Football podcast. You can get your daily insight to the best fantasy draft strategies so you can win your league this season, and you don't have to worry about running around the outside of the house, maybe missing a few pieces of clothing or whatever your league's rules are for the losers who've finished last place. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, Rob, let's continue breaking down the Seahawks 53-man roster, the initial 53-man roster. As everyone that listens to this show regularly should know, there's going to be moves coming after this, and we'll get to this later in the show, what kind of moves we think might be coming next for the Seahawks. There's usually some moves the day after these roster cuts. Once waivers go through, you will see some more churning of the roster for every team in the NFL, including the Seahawks. But looking from a more microscopic perspective, we just talked more of a macro, the players that got cut, the players that were placed on reserve PUP, terminated vested veterans. Let's look at some of the individual players here that we were surprised made the team and surprised did not make the team. And I want to start with the players that we were surprised managed to make this football team. And I think there's got to be one name that is way above everyone else. I mean, neither you or I, Jalen Sundell, was never on our radar to make this football team. Now, I thought he was a practice squad player. I had him listed as a practice squad guy for this team because you need insurance at the center position. But maybe you and I know here that Connor Williams has not played this preseason, and the Seahawks may want to have an extra insurance policy on their 53-man roster to open the season. And Sundell has been a player that has drawn rave reviews from the coaching staff, and the front office seems to have a lot of people in his corner. Sundell was definitely the most surprising addition, but maybe looking in retrospect, it shouldn't be as big of a surprise.
Well, I think part of the reason why it shouldn't be a surprise, Corbin, is, as you said, with Connor Williams, the center that the Seahawks, of course, traded for from the Miami Dolphins, signed from the previously the Miami Dolphins. it's going to take him some time to get onto the field. And with Jalen Sandell, you're talking about a player that played the left tackle position for some of his career at North Dakota State, a small school, but one that produces quality football players year in and year out. And he is better suited at the center position. He's 6'5", he's 300 pounds, so he's complete opposite type of a frame as, say, a Nick Harris, who, of course, the Seahawks had previously in. And this is a big-bodied center. And so he has a similar frame to the aforementioned Connor Williams. Oluwatimi is much squatter, 6'2", 320 pounds. And frankly, when I was watching tape all throughout training camp and the preseason games, Oluwatimi, who I was very, very high on as the Remington Award winner a couple of years ago, of course, I found him on the ground a lot more often than I was anticipating. And so I started asking around about Sandell and what the Seahawks thought about him. And they were kind of raving about the transition that he has made, again, from left tackle to center. They really like his smarts. They kind of acknowledge that was one of the things that they thought would be a transition and difficult one for him. Not only the level of competition, but just the football IQ of at center position, really understanding the playbook. And Sandell has been excelling in that way. So kudos to Jalen Sandell. I think that this is a very interesting sign for this, or a very interesting retention, I guess I should say, for the Seahawks. I hope for him that it's going to be something that lasts long term. I don't know that it will be. I was expecting, as well as you, that he was going to be on the practice squad.
Yeah, and this could be something where the Seahawks were worried because centers, again, it's offensive line. Maybe Sandell had enough good tape out there. They were worried that somebody might pluck him up off of their practice squad. There are a number of teams that have had injuries at the center position. That's why Nick Harris was traded back to the Browns. The Browns had an injury to their backup center. So there are a number of teams that are dealing with injuries there. That might be part of your rationale. Again, that is a bigger piece of the puzzle when you're putting this roster together than a lot of the other major factors, just how other teams around the league are going to be looking at certain positions. But I want to stay on the offensive line. Seattle, the 6th-round pick out of Utah, I was not very impressed the first couple preseason games with what I saw from him. I thought he really struggled in the game against Tennessee. But then this last weekend against Cleveland, I thought he easily played his best football. And maybe the Seahawks mindset here, again, McClendon Curtis was an undrafted player. They may feel he's going to be easier to sneak to the practice squad than somebody like Lamea, who was a 6th-round pick that, oh, by the way, has been an all Pac-12 performer both at tackle and guard. So he can play both those positions as well. Even though he's only been playing guard to this point for the Seahawks, he has ample experience playing the tackle position. So Seattle decided to stick with the draft pick there. I wasn't as surprised about Mike Jarrell making this team. In fact, I had him on the roster yesterday, as did you, thinking that Lucas was going to be on the PUP list. But I did not think that Seattle Lamea was going to make this team because I thought McClendon Curtis was the better player throughout training camp in the preseason. But Seattle is going with upside here. A 6th-rounder they think has a higher ceiling. That's got to be the rationale here.
I think it is. With Lamea, I'm a big fan of his. I've been a big fan of his. As you said, he was a multiple all Pac-12 player at Utah. Again, another program that is known for producing tough guys. And, I just like the lateral agility that he possesses. He can mirror, and there's not a lot of interior offensive linemen that can truly mirror in pass protection. I'd like to see him get a little bit more push in the running game. That's one of the areas that I thought McClendon Curtis was better. But I do think that one of the concerns I know that the Seahawks, or at least some, had with McClendon Curtis, for example, is that he was more of a jack of all trades rather than master of none. I think that there is a belief that Seattle Lamea may wind up being a starting caliber left guard in the future. And left guard is a relatively premium position along the offensive line. So I understand this move, but at the same time, I do believe it's a gamble just because I think that McClendon Curtis is a better, more proven player at this point. I wanted to kind of quickly switch over to the running back and wide receiver positions, Corbin, just because, I give you some credit. You called Kenny McIntosh making this roster. I did not see that happening. I did not see George Halani being one of the players that was cut. And the same thing with Cody White and Derek Thompson, when I see Cody White's tape, to me, is a little bit like Satoa Laumea in that I thought he got better with every single game. So I was really surprised that Cody White did not make this roster. And then with George Holani, as I said in yesterday's show, I just think that he's a better football player, all-around football player than Kenny McIntosh. So while I was initially stunned by the John Radigan move, and I understood it afterwards in terms of the salary cap, I am still frankly befuddled by the fact that George Holani is not among the top 53 on Seattle's list.
Yeah, that is still the most stunning move that the Seahawks made today. I'm going to, listen, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm off my rocker here. I just think when you turn on the tape, you watch training camp practice. And again, that's something that only a handful of us get, the privilege to be able to do, to watch all the training camp practices. But George Holani had a better training camp by every metric than what Kenny McIntosh did. But this, again, it may have to boil down to, Rob, Kenny McIntosh played at Georgia. He was a 7th-round pick, a better-known name. The Seahawks may feel that he would be a harder player to sneak to the practice squad. I think this is a major roll of the dice, though. I think there are a lot of teams out there that are going to see George Holani out there. Running back is not a position necessarily that a lot of guys get claimed on waivers, but because Holani's a really good blocker, he can play special teams, hard-nosed runner, and there are teams already dealing with injuries in the backfield. I would not be surprised at all if George Holani is claimed by another team here in the next 20 hours. So this, to me, is one of the biggest rolls of the dice. I would say McClendon Curtis and George Holani are the two biggest rolls of the dice in terms of the guys that got cut here, because Curtis's flexibility position-wise, he's 24. He's still got a lot of time to develop. Those are the two players that I feel like the Seahawks made at the end of the line say, man, why did we let those guys go? But at the end of the day, you just can't keep everybody. They chose to go with guys that were drafted previously. Maybe think Kenny McIntosh has a higher ceiling. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, but George Holani not making this roster. And one other name that I want to talk about real quick, Rob, DJ James. We talked about him a little bit yesterday. That was one that I actually was a little bit surprised by this morning. That was the first cut that was reported this morning by ESPN's Brady Henderson. And I can't say that I'm totally surprised, because a week and a half ago, you and I were both thinking that he was on the outside looking in. He had that really rough game in Nashville, the second preseason game, but he bounced back and played pretty darn well against Cleveland this past weekend. And with Artie Burns having his contract terminated, and we assume that injury is a big part of that, you would think DJ James is making this roster, because who else is going to be playing slot corner if Devin Witherspoon is playing out on the boundary? I guess Kobe Bryant could go back there, but he hasn't been playing that position. So that is one that really, really surprised me, just because of the injury situation. I thought DJ James was going to make this roster.
I did too, as for all the reasons that you just pointed out. That said, of course, there's an awful lot of players that getting cut elsewhere. And so I do think that nickel cornerback spot is going to be something the Seahawks are going to be fascinated by the waiver wire possibilities. One last player, we have to mention the inside linebacker position. Drake Thomas making this roster ahead of Michael Barrett, ahead of Patrick O'Connell and John Radigan. I'm not stunned by it, because, just knowing how much I love Drake Thomas's tape at North Carolina State, knowing that he was coming off the injury, seeing that he played pretty well against Cleveland in his first game back. I just was surprised that the Seahawks has opted to go with Drake Thomas, but I can tell you this, they absolutely love his brain. They think that he is one of the most instinctive linebackers they've had in their room in years, and that's including some of the past superstars, of course, that this club has had. So that, to me, is the play here, is that they really believe that Drake Thomas, they've got a real thumper behind Tyrell Dodson at that true Mike linebacker position.
And I'm glad you mentioned Michael Barrett, because he's literally been in Seattle for 3 days. I mentioned this in the show yesterday. I thought there was no way he was getting released by the Seahawks, because you just traded Mike Jackson to get him,
who made
now
Carolina
waivers. But look, he was a 7th-round pick. The Seahawks may very well think, hey, look, he almost went undrafted. We think we can sneak him through waivers. And maybe they didn't feel Drake Thomas was a player that they could do that with. So, again, that is such a big part of this when you're looking at the bottom of the roster players. You're trying to figure out which guys can we try to sneak to the practice squad and which ones do we need to keep because they're not going to be getting through. And it's not a perfect science. There may be some guys they cut that they end up losing. But you try to minimize that damage by releasing players you don't think are going to be high priorities for other teams who are, quite frankly, all trying to get down to 53-man roster as well. So there haven't been a lot of players claimed. You're just trying to avoid having that happen so you can get as many of those guys back in the practice squad as you can. When we continue our show, coming up next, the Seahawks made a number of moves today, but as we've talked about a number of times today, they're not done making moves. They're going to continue churning the roster, looking position by position. Where may the Seahawks have more moves coming up here in coming days before their week 1 game against the Broncos? We'll be taking a close look coming up next year on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Welcome back to Locked On Seahawks Tuesday edition. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined as always by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to each and every one of the 12s tuning in. Thank you as always for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. The Seahawks, like the rest of the NFL today, all 32 teams, cutting from 90 players to 53. A lot of really difficult decisions to be made. And as we just broke down, Rob, there were certainly some surprises for the Seahawks in terms of who was kept, which players ended up being cut that we thought were going to be on this roster. And at the end of the day, some of these guys in the Seahawks cut today will come back. That's just the way that this usually plays out. You've got to play the game. Maybe a week from now, you feel like Mike Jarrell is going to be able to get through waivers to the practice squad when you don't think he could have right now. That's just one example. But the Seahawks are going to be looking at the waiver wire right now, very active to see if there's any players like a Drake Thomas last year who they ended up claiming off waivers from the Raiders. They're going to be looking to see if there's some players on other teams' rosters that got cut that can come in and make their roster better. And so I want to take a look at the depth chart now in offense and defense and just kind of identify a few positions that we could see the Seahawks where they either have major needs in terms of depth or they could be looking for reinforcements for guys that can actually play on Sundays, but generally positions where there still may be room for improvement needed heading into the regular season.
Yeah, and I think that you have to start on the defensive side of the ball, just because that is, of course, Mike Macdonald's specialty, but it's also, as we've talked about before, cornerback and the true nose guard position. Really, you have Jonathan Hankins there. Obviously, the rookie Byron Murphy II is going to be playing an awful lot of football there, and you're hoping for the return of Cameron Young as well. But, you know, there's a former Seahawk that's available. Well, I guess in a way he's available. He signed with a UFL club. But Brian Monet is still available. So he is one of the names as far as the big run stuffers that I think would make some sense for the Seahawks if they want to go in that direction. And then at the nickel cornerback spot, a couple of corners that got released from their squads today. And perhaps they are going to be getting interest from their teams as far as being on the practice squad. But if the Seahawks do make a waiver claim, they are 16th, same spot they were, of course, in the NFL draft. That's the way that waiver process goes. And so if the Seahawks decide to put in a waiver claim, then they might be able to get one of these players. And three corners that have some experience inside of the nickel position, have the physicality, and are 28 years old or younger that I think would be interesting to the Seahawks. A couple of San Francisco 49ers players. Chase Lucas played his college ball at Arizona State. Rock Yassin, I believe it was at Temple, and he was at the San Francisco 49ers as well. And then DiCaprio Boodle is a little playmaker that I saw in camp with the Kansas City Chiefs a couple of years ago. And he's with the Carolina Panthers now. And it's kind of ironic that, of course, Seattle traded Mike Jackson to the Carolina Panthers, and perhaps with Mike Jackson making the Panthers 53, that might have pushed out Boodle. But again, he has some playmaking ability and some, just awareness in the running game that I think might be intriguing to the Seahawks if they do, in fact, feel that the nickel cornerback position is something that they need to address. As we know, Devin Witherspoon is going to be their starter at the nickel cornerback spot. So maybe they don't believe that that is a position of as much concern as the rest of us do. But I just think, considering how invaluable Witherspoon is to the Seahawks, it is a position that I think that they should be looking for some depth.
Yeah, I love it that you mentioned the interior defensive line, because right now with Cameron Young on the reserve pup list, again, he's got to miss a minimum of 4 games. He has not recovered near as quickly as what Mike Macdonald and the coaching staff thought he was going to. You really only have one nose tackle on Jonathan Hankins. He's 32 years old. Now, I think he's still got a lot of good football left in him, but This is not a spring chicken anymore. Jonathan Hankins is a big dude too, 335, 340 pounds, maybe bigger than that. You're not going to be able to play him a ton of snaps. And if they want to have a traditional nose in more often, they need to figure out what they're going to do in that regard, because Matt Gotel, I think, would have been that player. And then he suffered a high ankle sprain and then reached an injury settlement. It's going to be a while until he's going to be able to re-sign with the Seahawks or go to anybody else. So without Matt Gotel being there, are there any other big bodies that they can go out and they can find? You mentioned Brian Monet. Again, he's signed with the UFL team. I don't know that that's going to be a player they're going to be looking at bringing back, but those are the kind of body types they're looking for. They need another guy in this roster that can plug in and play that nose spot. I know that Jaron Reed has played some nose. I know that Leonard Williams has played some nose in the past, but these guys are not players that are going to be your prototypical run stuffers that play head up on the center and take on double teams. You need to get another big-bodied, girthy dude that can really, a country strong guy like an Al Woods that can really get the job done in the trenches. So I think that is one area that absolutely still could be addressed by the Seahawks. And looking at that back part of the defense, I still look at that linebacker spot and I wonder, is there going to be a player that gets cut that Mike McDonald is enamored by? Drake Thomas now being the fourth linebacker there. Maybe John Radigan comes back at a cheaper price. We were talking about that earlier. There's a lot of moving parts here, but there's so little experience behind Tyrell Dodson and Jerome Baker. Both those guys are on one-year deals. Drake Thomas has barely played in the NFL. Tyrese Knight has no regular season snaps. So that is a position that I'm looking at, along with slot corner. That may very well be why DJ James got cut, because the Seahawks feel, we think we can go out and get a better player for that spot that can fill the void left behind with Artie Burns being terminated, likely due to an injury. So those would be the three positions on defense that would jump out to me that I think moving forward, we can expect some moves, some more churning of the roster from the Seahawks. Now, on the offensive side of the football, they kept 11 tackles, or 11 offensive linemen, not 11 tackles. They kept 11 offensive linemen on the roster, which is more than they are going to have in week one. I can guarantee that. There's going to be some more shuffling there. I mentioned this earlier. I'm wondering if somebody like a Satoa Lamea or a Mike Jarrell or even a Stone Forsythe, a few days from now, once teams have already started churning through waiver wires and stuff, it's easier to get guys to the practice squad then, because remember, everyone else is trying to whittle down to 53 players as well. If you wait a few days, you might be able to sneak some of those O linemen onto your practice squad that if you did it today, you wouldn't have been able to. And so I think there's still going to be some moving parts there. I don't know if it's Forsythe. I don't know if it's Jarrell or Lamea. It could be a couple of those guys, but I find it hard to believe. Even Sundell, maybe, if Connor Williams looks like he's good to go, they may say, okay, we think we can get Sundell to our practice squad now. But O-line feels like an area there's still going to be some shaking up. And I could even see tight end being a sneaky position to watch here, that the Seahawks might think, you know what, Farrah Brown's been banged up. No offense, been banged up. Brady Russell's a good special teams guy. A.J. Barner struggled a little bit in his first training camp. That could be a position they could at least kick the tires. But I think the O-line, having some subtraction there and then opening up some spots for other places on offense and defense, that would be something that I would be betting heavy on here is going to happen, because 11 offensive linemen seems like way too many for the active roster.
Yeah, I could see a possibility that the Seahawks doing something along the offensive line. As you said, that number does feel pretty large. That said, the Seahawks have an awful lot of young, talented offensive linemen, as we talked about. I'm still stunned that McClendon Curtis is not on this initial roster. Otherwise, I don't see a lot of need around the rest of the offense. And there's going to be we're going to have some consternation at the quarterback position, of course. But to me, that's the beauty of acquiring Sam Howell. He is both a quality backup, which he has proven, as well as the possible quarterback of the future at his young age. So I don't think that you have to get a quarterback. I wouldn't be surprised if they decided to go the practice squad route there to find a possible scout team quarterback, especially one who has some kind of dual threat abilities, just to be able to kind of prepare your defense for upcoming opponents. Like if you're going to be playing Arizona and Kyler Murray, for example. But otherwise, I think the offense feels pretty solid in my opinion. Again, I was just surprised by some of the decisions they made at wide receiver. I personally liked Cody White more than Derek Young. I personally liked George Alani more than Kenny McIntosh. But at the same time, this is not about my personal preference, and it's not just even about what's on tape. A lot of this is that we're talking about some players, especially with Helani, who struggled with durability at Boise State. And so maybe the Seahawks basically in their medical staff, that they felt like this is a player who is going to break down. And perhaps they go with a player who, as you mentioned before, played at at Georgia and went through the rigors of that level of competition. So again, when it's all said and done, I feel like this is a quality roster. It's kind of fun throughout the process just because there were some surprises. And, Mike McDonald had a few more surprises this year, it felt like, than Pete Carroll has had in Seattle for the last several years.
Well, we expected there were going to be a few wrenches thrown in because you and I have not had a chance until now to see what Mike McDonald truly values as a head coach. And there were some guys released today that, it's not just Mike McDonald's decision either. It's the assistant coaches. It's John Schneider. We know he still carries the big stick when it comes to roster construction. So you have a lot of different voices trying to figure out what the best 53 is. And real quick, you mentioned the quarterback position. I'm just going to throw this name out there. Michael Pratt got cut by the Green Bay Packers today. The Seahawks met with him at the Combine. I would not be surprised if he clears waivers. That's really what's going to happen here. And maybe the Seahawks could be one of the teams that puts a claim in on him. I know the Seahawks liked him coming out of Tulane. He's got a lot of quality traits to develop. That would be a really fun QB to have as your number 3 guy to develop on the practice squad, or even if you're keeping 3 quarterbacks on the roster that you get your hands on, because Malik Willis is now the backup in Green Bay. So Michael Pratt is a name that I would keep an eye on. There's a few other guys out there. Maybe PJ Walker's coming back in the practice squad too, now that he knows the offense. But Michael Pratt is a name I would keep a very close eye on. As always, you can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. When we come back tomorrow, there's going to be more roster churning. We can guarantee it. We're going to be diving into the latest moves the Seahawks make and much more. Make sure that you're listening in and enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Go Hawks.